Hello. Once again, this is Ford Chumley. And due to some inconsistencies with our internet, we have decided to record our presentation on navigating IEPs again. Thank you all for your patience as we continue to learn and improve this process. Lara Holzman, our manager of special education, gave a wonderful presentation and answered some great questions from parents who joined in, which I will be fielding to her at the end of this video. So stay tuned. And without further ado, here is Lara.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being a part of this. We're glad that you're here and watching this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about IEPs and introduce the difference between 504s and IEPs, kind of give a general overview of IEPs. We'll offer some resources at the end, and then we will also do the questions that Ford just mentioned. So again, my name's Lara Holzman. I am not an educational lawyer, so I just want to put that out there. And this is meant to be just general information. I've been working with IEPs for about 10 years or so with all the different school districts around the state of Colorado, as well as some out-of-state districts as well. One of the things I've noticed is that this special education is a federal law, but there are also pieces that come into play with each school district, and each school district does things a little bit differently. So this, like I said before, will just be a general overview. One of the other concepts I wanted to introduce that you'll see with the GROW website or the Facebook group are connection circles. And in our previous recording, we did a mini connection circle where I asked people what was one of their favorite times that they remember in their educational career where they felt successful or that they really enjoyed. So a good memory of that. And a lot of people talked about being successful with projects or having a principal who really supported them or a teacher that really supported them. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because as you go through this process, whether it's a 504 plan or an IEP, it's important to remember that it's a team process. So, and that team can include a gen ed teacher, a special ed teacher, it can include a principal, it can include speech pathologist, occupational therapist, physical therapist, social workers, school psychologists, but most importantly, it also includes the parents and guardians who have educational rights for that student. Parents and guardians are the biggest advocates for their students and their children, so please take a very active role in that process, whether you do a 504 or an IEP. So the difference between a 504 and an IEP, a 504 plan is a plan written up that is reviewed annually that basically has an accommodation or several accommodations in it just to help a student be successful throughout the day. So if, for example, a student might have a hard time sitting in their chair, maybe they have ADHD and a lot of energy, and they just need to move a little more frequently than other people in their classroom. A 504 plan could be developed to offer that student scheduled breaks throughout the day. That might be one example of what a 504 might be written for. Another example of a 504 might be if somebody has a physical ailment, maybe that they need to have more room around their desk area for, say, maybe like a wheelchair or something like that, then a 504 plan might be put into place to make sure that they have all the space that they need. An IEP, on the other hand, is considered special education, and there's a process that happens in order for a student to obtain an IEP. The first thing that needs to happen is all sorts of different assessments to take place to see if the student qualifies for special education. So a group, a team comes together and says, hey, let's assess this student. That could be driven by a teacher, it could be driven by a parent, could be driven by a speech person or a social worker or a psychologist. So once that happens, that request happens, the team then has 60 days in order to create the assessments, go through all the assessments, and have a meeting to see if that student or child qualifies for special education. If they qualify for special education, then an IEP will be written. Now, sometimes with this process, within those 60 days after written consent from the parents or the guardians, sometimes what happens is that people do believe that this student will probably qualify, and they might start a draft of an IEP. So that meeting that comes within that 60 days could be only going over the assessments and deciding if a student qualifies for special education, or it could be that plus talking about the draft of the IEP. So it just kind of depends on the school district and the team and how much time people have. Typically, that first meeting to see if somebody qualifies for special education can take anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on how much information the team needs to go over to see if the student qualifies. Once a student qualifies for an IEP, then there's two different types of IEPs. Well, it's the same IEP, but the first one is an annual review. So that IEP is written for a year. So every year that IEP should be reevaluated. It can be reevaluated prior to a year being up if that is requested and something needs to happen, like changes or something like that. But it should be reviewed every year with that team that put that IEP together. By law, every IEP should be reviewed. It's called a reevaluation every 3 years, and that includes the assessment pieces. So the annual doesn't necessarily include more assessments or to redo assessments or things like that. But a reevaluation, which is required every 3 years, needs to have more assessments and things like that done in order to make sure that the student still qualifies for special education. Because just because you're on an IEP doesn't mean that a student's going to be on their IEP their whole entire educational career. So that reevaluation is really important. It also can happen prior to those 3 years being up. So if somebody requests assessments or a reevaluation prior to those 3 years, that's okay. That can happen as well. One document that's really important as you go through this process is called the prior written notice, or the PWN. And that prior written notice talks about all sorts of different things depending on the situation, but it's documentation of the process, of maybe excuse me, questions that you might have. It might be a process that includes if there's something you agree with or don't agree with. So you'll hear that term PWN, or prior written notice, hopefully several times as you go through the process, if you're going through the IEP process. So the IEP itself at the beginning is strengths section and present levels. And that part of the IEP is very important. After somebody has read through a present levels section of the IEP, they should have a good idea of who this student is and what this student is capable of doing at this time in their educational path. So the present level should be pretty detailed. It should talk about different assessments, if there were assessments that were done. And it's pretty much the meat of the IEP as far as understanding the student. The next section from there is a consideration of special factors. And that includes things like a healthcare plan, or a transportation plan, or a behavior intervention plan, All of those are separate documents and may be important for your student. So please pay attention to that section and make sure that those documents are included if there's a need for those documents. Going on from there is a section called Accommodations and Modifications. There is a difference between accommodations and modifications. Accommodations are things that are put into place on a daily basis or semi-daily basis to help your student be successful day in and day out. So things like frequent breaks or extended time on assessments or for assignments. It might be using graphic organizers to help your student stay organized, or using checklists. It might be things like manipulatives for math. So there's lots of things that can go into the accommodations section. That is also where if they take district or state assessments, some of those accommodations might be listed in there as well. Modifications, on the other hand, are things that alter the curriculum that they're being taught or that is being used to teach them. So for example, if your student is on extended outcome parts, then that would be a place that maybe it would be listed under modification. So there is a difference between accommodations and modifications. Another big important section of the IEP are the goals. Personally, I think one of the most important pieces of the goals section is to make sure that a student doesn't have too many goals. Remember, the IEP is written for 1 year. And so sometimes what happens, and I've seen it frequently, is that when you have several people involved as part of the team for the IEP, many times there's 8 goals written, 10 goals written, 12 goals written. In my personal opinion, that's way too many goals. A student can't focus on those many things throughout the year. If you think about even an adult, we as adults typically don't have 10 or 12 goals that we've put in place for ourselves for the near future. So it's important to look through those goals, and maybe some people can combine goals. For example, if you have an occupational therapist who wants to have a goal regarding fine motor skills, such as writing, maybe the OT and the teacher could work together and combine a goal so that that goal is being worked on both in the classroom with the teacher as well as with the OT. That also creates some consistency, because one of the other pieces about the goals is that they need to be obtainable. And if you have 8 goals, like I've said, 10 goals, 12 goals, that might not be obtainable. So it's important that those goals are obtainable and make sense for everybody. The next section, and probably one of the most important sections as well, is what's called the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. And the team as a whole decides what the LRE is. So on an IEP, you would see that a student might be in a gen ed classroom, a general education classroom, 80% or more of the day. That would be considered the least restrictive environment. The next one down from that is in a gen ed classroom from 40% of the day to 79% of the day. So maybe they're getting pulled out to work on certain things or things like that. Maybe they're in a special ed classroom for part of the day. The next one down from that is in a gen ed classroom less than 40% of the day. So maybe it's a self-contained classroom that they're in most of the day. Maybe they go to lunch with their peers, but they're in that self-contained classroom the majority of the day. After that, the next listing on there is what's called separate school. And separate school means that the school district has decided, along with the rest of the team, that they can't necessarily meet the needs of that student in their home school. So they're going to look outside of the home school to see if there's another placement for that student. Sometimes you'll hear some of these schools referred to as facility schools. Gold Star actually has a facility school. It's called Starbound Academy. But in those cases, it's a team decision to say that this homeschool that the student should be attending can't meet their needs, so we're going to look elsewhere to meet the needs of that student. And that's when a place like Joshua School or Starbound Academy or Tennyson Center or those types of schools might come into play. But again, that's a team decision, and it needs to be documented in the IEP. The one thing to remember about an IEP is that it is a legal document. So whatever is written in the IEP should be followed by the school. And if it's not followed by the school, then an amendment needs to be made to the IEP. The team should come together as a group. Sometimes with amendments, they all agree that you don't need to come together as a group. But usually, if there's going to be amendments made to an IEP, the group should come back together, the team should come back together and decide that together. The other piece of an IEP is extended school year, or ESY. And that means that the students need help to maintain their skills throughout the summer. And again, that's a team decision to say, yes, if this student doesn't have help during the summer, they're going to regress over the summer months. And when they come back in the fall, they're going to be far behind and will need extra time to catch up. So that's what ESY, or extended school year, really focuses on, is helping students maintain their skills over the summer so that they don't come back in the fall to be way behind. So that's pretty much the basics of an IEP, a 504 versus an IEP, and kind of a general description around all of that. Like I said, on the Grow Facebook page, we will list some resources that can help you with this process. One of them is the Office of Special Education, and that's through the Colorado Department of Education website, or the CDE website. That's a great resource. They have a lot of information on there. And if you have time to navigate through there, that can help answer a lot of your questions. Also, I had mentioned if the IEP is not being followed, then an amendment should happen and the team should come together and talk through that. If for some reason a parent or guardian doesn't agree with an IEP or doesn't agree with the amendments, and they've worked with the school district to kind of get through that process and it's still not going where they want it to go, they can enter into manifestation, and the Department of Special Ed has a good resource on there about resolving disagreements and how to work through that. So that's on there as well, along with special ed questions, frequently asked questions. That's another part of those resources that will be on there. Another link that will be on there is what's called your procedural safeguards. If your student is declared special education or qualifies for special education, the procedural safeguards are basically the special education laws. And that's an important document for you to understand as you go through this process. Because like I said, the IEP is a legal document. So it's important for you to understand what that means and what your rights are as a parent or guardian. So those resources will be available on the Grow Facebook page. So thank you again for being part of that page and joining us. I think I'm going to defer to Ford now with some of the questions that we had in our earlier recording.
All right. Thank you so much, Laura. That was so wonderful and such great information for our parents and our community at large. During our original recording of the presentation, one of our wonderful parents, Laura Schmidt, had asked some great questions, and I wanted to credit her with those and also field those to Laura because it was information that I think is helpful for everybody. So one of the questions that she asked is, can you have both an IEP and a 504 plan? And if so, in what cases would you need both?
So typically the answer would be no, you would not have a 504 and an IEP. Typically anything that was listed in a 504 would be probably absorbed into an IEP. So typically the answer would be no. I was trying to think of certain situations where you might need both, and I had a hard time coming up with that. So I would say typically no, you wouldn't have both.
Okay, great. Laura asked another great question, which is, should your child be part of the IEP meeting? What age would be a good time to start having them participate in these meetings?
That's a great question. I strongly believe that a child should be involved in the IEP process if it's something that seems appropriate from the team and the parents and guardians. And that can start as young as 5 years old, maybe. Now, when I say being part of the process, that's where you can differentiate and see what's most age appropriate. Maybe a student only joins for the first 5 minutes to meet the team and see who everybody is and to get a brief understanding of what the team is doing. I typically say when I start an IEP meeting, if a student is involved, is that this is the team that is helping you be successful throughout your day when you're in school. So something along those lines of introducing them to the team and having them be a part of understanding what an IEP is and why it's important. The other piece of children understanding that is that they should be aware of what their goals are and what they're working on. So sometimes in an IEP meeting, like I said, a student might just come for the first 5 minutes to get introduced to everybody and so that they know who the team is that's helping them. Another time that they might be a part of the IEP is maybe just for the goals section so that they understand what goals they're working on. Typically, if an IEP meeting is going to go for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, I typically wouldn't have a student sit through the entire meeting because that can be very long and not very enjoyable for a student, and they'll probably tune out after a little ways. But I do think it's important for them to be an advocate for themselves and understand what the process is.
Okay, great. Laura had also asked if a 504 plan can be utilized for after-school programs and activities.
So yes, there are cases where that could come into play. Typically, it would come into play if those extracurricular activities are sponsored by the school. If it's an outside organization that's sponsoring that, then typically there might be something else that is put into play with that outside organization. If it is a school-sponsored event, like a chess club or something like that, then if a team deems it necessary, then yes, there could possibly be a 504. It could also possibly be added into the IEP if the IEP team agrees that those extracurricular activities are important to that student's success. So yes, there is a possibility for that. And that's something I would work with your school team on to make sure that those are in place, again, if it is a school-sponsored event.
Okay, very good. And Laura had also mentioned that, over the past couple of years, the pandemic has greatly impacted not just our wonderful special education students, but students at large in what they have been able to achieve at school. And we thought that was a great topic. And we wanted to mention that in one of these links that is posted on this page, there is a frequently asked questions section on all COVID-19 matters and how they apply to the Department of Education and special education specifically. So if you click on that link that takes you to the main special education page on the Colorado Department of Education, you can get some more information on the stipulations surrounding COVID. So with that, go ahead, Laura.
Sorry, Ford. I was just going to jump in and say, I would highly recommend looking through that. There's been a lot of debate on how to help our students gain what some people feel like they have lost over the last year and a half due to COVID, and whose responsibility is that, and how can the school districts help with that. And so there's a lot of good information on the CDE website that can help with that process and hopefully help everybody get through that. So great resource. Thanks, Ford.
You're welcome. And thank you so much, Laura. That was a great presentation. And I think it's going to be super helpful for all of our parents and the larger Gold Star community. So thank you all so much for watching, and thank you again for your patience as we continue to refine this process. We're so excited to be able to offer these presentations. So stay tuned for future presentations, and please do check out those resources that we have posted here on the page. So that's it for us. Thank you again so much for watching, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, bye.
Bye.